Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's PropMoto webinar. My name is Franco. I will be moderating this as always. I'm the editor and co-founder of PropMoto, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about data and AI and how it's being used to manage energy use in buildings. The topic that gets brought up a lot, but I think it's more complicated than most people make it out to be. I think not only are you dealing with all of the building and property factors, but there's lots of other variables that have to be taken into consideration, right? We got changing energy prices, energy mix, right? Sustainability mandate, changing climate, if you believe in that. Lots of kind of trend lines that are all coming together to make it a little bit of a difficult proposition to really understand how to lower energy and hopefully carbon footprint. So I'm going to be going over some trends, some specifics about how to actually do it. As always, this is a live webinar, and we won't be saving any time at the end for questions. In fact, we'd rather you all just throw your questions out as we're talking. So as you see, we have a chat here. We have you can ask questions. Feel free, jump in. If they're pertinent, I'll bring it up to the panelists and we'll talk about it right on the spot. So appreciate everybody here. I know I see a lot of really sophisticated people that have signed up for this. I know you guys all have some opinions and some questions, so we're looking forward to fielding that as they come. So before we start, I would like to introduce my distinguished panelists here. First, we have Cass McFadden. She's Global Head of Sustainability for Cortland. They're, as probably most of you know, a large multifamily owner and operator. Hi, Cass.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Next, we have Matt House. He's Director of Enterprise Sales at Omnidian. They're a solar service provider. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Franco.
Yeah, looking forward to your insights about all of the renewable, because that is another fold to this that makes it very tricky to understand energy and energy usage. And last but certainly not least, we have Tony Liu. He's president of Partner Energy. They're an international due diligence and engineering firm. Hi, Tony.
Hi, how are you?
Doing great. Excited to be here with everybody. I got some great minds, and hopefully we can hash out some of these kind of difficult scenarios. But before we do, I always like to start these out just by talking some of the trends happening right now. I think this kind of sets the stage for everything we'll likely talk about later on in the webinar. I think probably foremost on most people's minds is what's happening with energy. I think particularly now, it seems like sustainability is kind of taking a back seat to profitability, at least for a lot of occupiers, a lot of firms. Profitability is difficult right now when you're looking at what are likely changing energy prices, right? So I'd like to maybe just talk to all of you about kind of where you see the energy mix going, right? Both where we're generating energy in the country, and obviously that changes by utility. But also, just generally where prices are headed, maybe how prices are getting calculated is changing through a lot of utilities. So just kind of interested to hear what you kind of think is happening as far as the energy mix in that country. Tony, I'd love to start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's tough to talk about energy pricing, energy needs without talking a little bit about demand. I think data centers, AI, this is the topic here. AI is very data center. It's very high demand from data centers, and data centers are one of the biggest drivers of our energy needs in this country, really in the world. So when we look at it, the demand from data centers, from electric vehicles, even electrification, these things are all going to drive energy prices up. In my world, where we looked at kind of more engineering due diligence in the CRE space, one of the biggest things that a lot of our clients are looking at and concerned about is the changing regulatory environment, right? There are a lot of jurisdictions that are requiring energy benchmarking, energy audits, and then there's the kind of the tougher one, which is building performance standards. So there are jurisdictions, so if you own real estate in New York or Maryland or Denver, they're regulating the amount of carbon, amount of energy buildings can use, and this is certainly going to continue to drive up some of the costs around that.
Absolutely. Matt, I'd love to kind of have you expand on that, particularly when it comes to on-site generation, right? Like, what are your clients seeing as far as the trend of energy prices and kind of how that fits into how they're able to make renewables pencil?
Yeah, the calculus has changed quite a bit, quite frankly, over the last couple months. Solar just got about 30% more expensive, effectively, for projects that have not begun development due to the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill. But in addition, as everybody is seeing in the news, it feels like on a rolling, like monthly basis, utility rates are going up 10, 12, 13% in lots of regions. And so I think right now there's a little, it's in a weird spot. People are trying to recalibrate, figure out, okay, where does this best pencil in for my portfolio? However, the demand is continuing to rise, right? Usage at particular buildings, especially with electrification, are continuing to drive these things. ESG mandates are still, although are a little shaky right now for some folks. I think generally speaking, people are still very strong. And so there's just a slight recalculus of things, but demand is still strong for solar. So we're still seeing continued development of on-site solar plus storage where it makes sense. It's just a little bit different now. So there's just right now it's just a period of recalibration.
Yeah, and it's kind of going the opposite way I think some people thought, right? And drill, baby, drill, going back to fossil fuels. I think people kind of assumed that might drive down energy prices, and certainly has not. And I haven't seen any evidence that it will, right, in the near future here. Kath, I'd love to hear from you on this. And I know that you guys are know a lot about these mandates. So I'd maybe love to hear from you about that, right? How are both energy prices and these kind of city mandates dictating the way you guys are thinking about your energy usage?
Yeah, sort of new things that are added. I mean, there are EV structures, there are data centers. From a multifamily perspective, we're thinking about amenity spaces. If there's a new fitness center and folks want sort of that Peloton bike, okay, we have to plug all of those in. And there might be other things that, residents are interested in adding to the individual units over time. If you think about, how many chargers you have now and how many devices are connected to that. So that list continues to grow. And so we have to think about it from that perspective, in addition to the common area spaces. So these are our, amenity spaces that residents go in, utilize for their enjoyment. We try to control those expenses over time, but we might have some continued exposure in areas where we may not have total forecasting or price control, or maybe we're under a contract that still has a high price, et cetera. So that's how we kind of think about how energy pricing and demand really hits the different assets. And then I think on the other side, when you talk about the markets and the regulatory inputs that we often have to contend with, I mean, most of them that are currently in place really try to drive us to energy efficiency. But in the middle, we have to probably execute a new project or a new sort of technical or infrastructure component that is going to have a cost consideration. And then we have to do, some math behind that return. There might be an upfront cost, but long-term, we might be gaining the energy efficiency or the contract control that we need. So there are a lot of factors, again, impacting energy pricing. I think for us, it's really thinking through gaining efficiencies. Ultimately, everyone's in a race towards zero, whether they think it or not, when it comes to efficiency. But while also, again, in the multifamily space, thinking through how do you not sort of put a damper on the resident experience. They're going to want to add things, like I said, to their units. We're in a different space in multifamily now where there's a different demand around amenity spaces. I mean, I'm sure if you think back to your own first apartment experiences, all the bells and whistles of the added, amenity components and the new services. It's very different now. So that ends up hiking demand at each asset, and we now have to factor in how are we going to forecast and control that component.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear from you about that forecasting, right? Because, how far ahead do you look? And I'm thinking particularly about EVs here, right? I think, when they first came out, we saw everybody buying them up. They were growing in their percentage of sales. I think, one day are we going to have every single parking spot have an EV charger? Well, that is a significant pull, right? For a property is you need new, direct power lines, a lot more amperage, right? So, how far do you look at, and how much do you think that demand for EV is really going to change in let's say the next 10 years?
Yeah, I know if I was answering this maybe a few months ago or like a year ago, I'd have a different response. Things have clearly changed in terms of electric vehicle incentives. But again, thinking about multifamily and the asset, I will say there is a bit of a, chicken and the egg dilemma that a lot of multifamily operators kind of deal with at the outset. What is the demand? How many spaces should you plan for? Is it 2 chargers, 6 chargers? Is it, a whole floor? And there are specific market demands around the amount of parking that you have to supply, maybe for your residents or within a given area. But once you get past checking those boxes, it's really thinking through what is the owner's appetite, especially given that that one asset might not be their only EV infrastructure investment, right? It might be thinking through 216 communities. Some might want to, sort of pilot 6 and then see if residents really like, maybe the level 1 or level 2. I think level 1's probably a little out, but level 2 chargers that you've put in place. And if there's growing demand and you've got a good financial system around it where maybe residents are, sort of paying for their usage, there might be an amenity fee, et cetera, just a good setup so that you can control the cost, but the residents are also happy with the experience and the product. Then you might look to scale from there. So I think it's going to vary, based on the owners and operators, but ultimately, at least my personal perspective is that you have to get to a pilot phase to understand the true demand. Saying that you have, 400 units and multiplying that out across residents and trying to dial in how many might have EVs or how many might be interested. It's a little tough to do. And I've heard percentages thrown out, plan for 10% of your space. And then there are jurisdictions where, the regulatory bodies are working closely with the utilities to maybe plan for all spaces being EV capable. So it'll vary market by market, but I think as an owner, you really have to start to pilot so you can see what your individualized demand would be.
Yeah, absolutely. And market to market, I mean, California, we see a lot of them, and obviously other places a lot less. Tony, what do you guys hear from your clients about EV charging, right? That's a big new power draw. I think, everybody wants to put as much as they can in, but I think there's a lot of limitations, right? About how much, you can actually provide.
Sure. I think when you're selecting sites, I think the dynamics have changed, right? It's like electrical capacity is just worth its weight in gold, right? You don't have to have a nice building. It doesn't even need to be particularly clean from an environmental perspective, but if you're next to the grid and you have a lot of power going to it, it definitely, there's a lot of opportunities for that particular site. But the piggyback off that answer from Cass is, I think we got to look at the technology too. I think technology has evolved so that the amount of time it takes to charge some of these EVs are getting comparable to how much time you spend at the gas station. Right? If you look at it, I have an EV. If I go to a high-speed charger, it takes me about 30 minutes to get to 80%. But if you look at some of the new technology, that time is significantly dropping down to 10, 20 minutes. Right? If you're comparable to a gas station, you all of a sudden you don't have to build EV infrastructure everywhere. You can just have centralized EV charging stations, and I think that works pretty well. So I think technology is going to come into play, certainly from that perspective. But otherwise, I think it's an amenity, right? It's an amenity folks want to be able to offer. I think, like everyone's saying, I think dynamics have changed. But I think in terms of building owners just wanting to understand, I at least need a few, right? It may not be, 10, 20, 30% of it, but I need a few. So, we do find ourselves often seeing, how much electrical capacity is at this building? How much does it cost to drag, a 240-volt wire from the main transformer down to the parking lot, Right? So these cost considerations are being considered during due diligence as well as estimate.
Mm-hmm. Matt, I want to hear from you about EVs, but with your specialization, I think what's interesting to me is how EVs represent a little bit of a different charging pattern, right? That, or a different kind of load pattern that might not jibe perfectly with solar, yet they also do store energy, right? We can kind of charge them at certain times when the grid isn't as expensive. So how do you think that kind of solar on-site generation and EVs kind of play together the best?
It really depends on a property by property level. We're seeing a lot of deployment of PV plus battery plus EV charging. Some of it's mandate driven. Some of it is, really just about amenities per site. I think what it comes down to is ensuring you have enough generation, right, on site. If it's kind of directly powering those chargers, either directly from the PV plus battery, ensuring that's set up correctly. But I think, another thing that we're kind of learning through the process is, up to, I think it's like 30% of EV chargers are down at any given time. It's a lot. And for those who drive EVs, if you've ever pulled up to a charger and it was not operable, it's frustrating. I mean, if 30% of gas pumps were out of service at any given time, there'd be riots in the streets.
Yeah.
Very frustrating. And so I think folks are starting to learn that and understand, like, hey, like if you're offering this as an amenity and it does not work, that can be, you could be in a worse position than even before offering it, because you're kind of dangling it in front of them, and there's the frustration of trying to make it work and whatnot. And so, folks are starting to learn about understanding, how do we service these things? How do we keep them online? Because ultimately, what good is an EV charger? What good is an amenity if it's not, providing that for the customer?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of a little bit about what we're seeing within the space.
What about, do you think it increases the desire for solar and on-site? I mean, like most people charge at night, solar is generating during the day, right? How do those play together the best, do you think?
Oh, of course. I mean, the load profile for a charger, depending on its structure, can be quite substantial.
Mm-hmm.
For folks, sometimes that has to be paired with solar plus storage. And so, with the storage component, that can be better paired for amenities charging at night and through the early morning. We're seeing a lot of deployment, especially around carports, with solar plus EV charging too, which is a great amenity for corporates or any sort of business that's
Mm-hmm.
having customers during the daytime. And so, yeah, it just kind of depends on the profile. But what we'd say is that, if there's a solar plus storage component, that can be pretty comprehensive in how you want to deliver EV charging. It gives a lot more resiliency.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we get into the data part of this conversation, I do want to touch on one other piece, which is financing, right? You kind of talked, Matt, about, prices are going up, right? There's less subsidies kind of helping you, but, a lot of financing options still exist. I'm thinking particularly about CPACE, right? This is a state by state run program. So the federal government has not been able to dismantle it yet. Do you think that people are still able to make large investments in, let's say, sustainability, generation, or even kind of, power reduction improvements, able to make those work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we do see CPACE financing as something that is growing, but PPA structures still remain very strong. And so I think for portfolio owners of commercial real estate who are looking to deploy solar, there are lots of financing entities that are willing to offer PPA structures, with portfolio tranches. And so even for smaller systems, right? If especially for multifamily and other entities where usually the ability to deploy solar can be on kind of a smaller scale. Looking across a nationwide footprint, yeah, there's absolutely financing structures that are available.
But just to add, the irony of rising energy costs is the investment in energy efficiency renewables gets better, right?
Yeah.
It's changing constantly, right? Certainly the federal rebates going away have a big impact, but you got to look at local rebates, and then you got to look at utility rebates. But you also need to understand what the cost of energy is, right? What the cost of electricity is in your local markets at that particular point in time. So, as energy prices go high, it's higher. It certainly makes capital investment in efficiency and renewables better.
Mm-hmm. And Cass, how about you guys? I mean, I think what's so interesting to me is that, it's hard, right? You're hitting a moving target. You don't really know what your energy expenses are going to be. Whereas if you do invest in something like on-site renewables, solar, you kind of do, right? You kind of take an unknown and create a known. I mean, how are you guys thinking about, that kind of investment, and how are you able to maybe finance them?
Yeah, I think obviously starting with just raw data, we understand energy consumption year over year. And then we have a pretty good pulse on understanding in the regulatory environment when rates are going to graduate. And there can be spikes, but we have a renewable energy procurement strategy where we really try to control the costs where we can, and where we know we're financially responsible as an owner. I think beyond that, as we think through different opportunities to model, the financial options. One thing that's trending is kind of the combination of, public and private funding, so you can reduce risk and attract more capital, right? So we look at that structure, thinking through energy as a service. There are different vendors who talk through options. It could be like a solar and storage combination that we've kind of touched on. So without potentially owning the equipment, you could, reduce upfront costs, et cetera, right? And that's probably more favorable sometimes for, let's say, asset managers that are very nervous about infrastructure upgrades because it might, impact the structure in a way that a seller might not find attractive, for example. So that model is still there. I think, C-PACE or generally like PACE kind of financing. I still think there's a cap. People have to remember that, like a cap on loans for renewables and resiliency upgrades. And through that, I mean, you have to decide in your business structure. So these are things we think through. Do we really want to have things repaid through tax assessments, even though there are favorable terms? Are there other components of, a contractual agreement that, again, aren't favorable to maybe our hold periods and what our investors might want? So those things can sometimes be limitations. But I know Matt also mentioned like existing, the existing PPA structure, or even virtual power purchase agreements. I think that's ultimately a financial transaction, but folks in this environment where, especially if you haven't started a solar project or you haven't procured equipment or started, any work that might qualify for these sort of umbrella periods that are covered. Now, I think practitioners think through shifting strategy or shifting timelines. We don't know when, the incentives might be reinstated or extended. And so again, I think that some of those financing options, especially the combining public and private funding, if a firm can afford that, might become more viable if even for a limited period.
Okay, so let's get into some of this data, right? I think everybody is curious to understand how, it sounds great, like let's lower your energy use, lower your, carbon footprint, but it's not always that easy. So let's talk about first kind of getting the data. What kind of data do you think that is the most valuable for this, and how granular does it have to be? I know that utilities often they report right monthly, right? They don't give you I'm sure the kind of granularity that you need. So Cass, I want to stick with you on this one, and then I'll go to the rest.
Yeah, for on our end, I feel pretty spoiled now in that everything is pretty streamlined. We have an external vendor that we work with who helps us sort through the bills, capture electricity at the kilowatt hour metric. We understand what the rate is per kWh. Same thing for our gas metric, oil if we have it for any place, for generators, et cetera. We also have this for many other things, water, waste, et cetera. So we're capturing it at that granular level. I think How much of it you need, it really depends on your team and what they can withstand when it comes to, analysis. So if you have a perfected integrated sort of AI system that can spit out, interval data or even like a weekly snapshot, et cetera, you think, okay, well, your operational teams can kind of see where there might be spikes, where there are drops, and physically at the asset level react to that. But we do have a centralized utilities team that usually looks at this on a monthly basis, accounting for any variances, et cetera. And then as we combine that with our, internal sustainability function, we're really looking for what really stands out. If in a market there is an asset that maybe is no bigger or smaller than another one, but we're seeing very high usage somewhere, it could be related to common area, EVs, whatever it is. That is what we want to tackle. Because like I said, there's a bigger sort of like road to zero, but we also think of NOI or just like the financial performance at the asset. And it's not something that if we can tackle it, make it more efficient or bring it to zero, it's not something we want to keep spending money on in terms of like audits and reassessing this every year. It's like we've assessed it, we know the historical performance, let's get to it. And one other thing I would add is this is a little broader, but it's sort of like your maintenance metrics, you want to know, it's not the same as sort of like a kilowatt hour or whatever it is, or a therm, but just understanding, how often you're going to have to respond to something, that's part of your infrastructure is important because that just becomes part of your cost management.
Yeah, absolutely. Tony, when you guys work with clients, what do you often recommend as far as, getting a little bit more sophisticated about the data they collect?
Sure. I think to back up a little bit, I think it's largely driven from my perspective, kind of on a couple of data points, right? It's the size of the building. Like certainly a 1,000,000 square foot office building is a little bit different than a 5,000 square foot retail center. The asset type / the lease type, right? Is the owner paying the bill, or is it your multifamily, your tenants paying everything? And then the last piece, really, which is a newer factor, is what's the regulatory environment, right? Are you located in a building performance standard where there's, an impending fine, which could reach into the 7 figures if you don't hit a certain performance metric, right? So for a large building, like the example in a big office building in Denver, Colorado, right? The more granular, the more detail, all that capital is really worth it, right? So these control systems right, when you have large buildings, they really operate like a large computer, and there's a lot of data going in there. So there is technology today through AI, through traditional controls, sequence operations that it is managing it, right? So any optimization can result in a very big impact, right? So I would go down to what time is the chiller turning on? What pumps are sequencing on and off and during what time of day, right? So looking at these details for a large building and investing in a sophisticated control systems will have a payback to it, right? A reasonable one, because you're using a lot of energy. It's directly impacting the owner. So I think those types of investments make all the sense in the world. But for a smaller building where perhaps the tenants are paying their own utility bills and it's not located in a jurisdiction, I think it's a little bit tougher, right? I think having monthly data about how much gas, electric the tenants are using and giving it to the owner might make sense. But I think here is kind of where you play the end of useful life game, right? It's like you're not really controlling what the tenant's doing and how much energy they're using, but upon end of useful life, this is where you can probably make the most impact, right? It's supposed to going for like and replacement of a split system. You go more efficient because in the end of the day, it's going to help your own carbon and energy usage as well as the tenant. So that could be where the line is. I think you look at the size, the type of regulatory environment really dictates what the strategy.
Yeah, so you're saying it's sometimes it isn't even worth it to, invest too much in getting every single super granular piece of data, right? Like,
Yeah.
What are you going to do? Your tenant's going to use the energy no matter how much you know about their usage or not, right?
Or if they use it 24 hours a day versus 1 hour a day, it just doesn't make that big impact, right? Again, a small building, it just doesn't impact it that much, right? I think size is really where it makes the most impact.
Yeah, and multi-tenant buildings, obviously, right? Because now you're kind of comparing, different usages to each other. Matt, interested to hear a little bit from you, particularly as it comes to like the data that you need to really understand solar, right? And the impact of solar. I think a lot of people are probably considering going solar and maybe don't have like the clear roadmap of exactly what they're going to save when they're, when the peak, how you can shave your peak usage and all of that. So what do you think is kind of that critical data for every building owner to understand?
Solar generation data is probably the most important component, because I mean, if a solar plant doesn't have energy generation data associated to it, did it even produce energy? That's a big question that we have to actually answer quite a bit. When it comes to granularity, the devil's in the details. And as much as we'd love to just look at a month's worth of production data or maybe even a day's worth, you're not going to find issues necessarily with that. You have to go even further in. So when it comes to, on-site generation, granularity needs to be down to about 5 or 10 minute intervals. And as many signals as you can get from a system, right? That can be energy, it can be power voltage, other alerting, anything and everything that can pull with the given hardware on site. But to my first point that I wanted to elaborate on, this is all contingent on perfect communications from devices on site, right? The Internet of Things. And it's great when it works. But what happens when you lose that communication? What kind of assumptions do you make? Do you assume that things were working as intended and you normalize the data and go from there? Or do you assume that nothing was working as intended and we have no signals and it actually means there was no generation or whatever signal you're pulling from? Those are things that asset managers need to think about and have a contingency plan for, because those can oftentimes be the most complicated and time-consuming scenarios when faced with that lack of data.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking back to our previous conversations, Matt, about how, I assumed solar panels to be infallible, right? You stick them in the sun, energy comes out the other end, but they, especially kind of when you first install them, right, there are possible problems. Like they tend to have little blips or they go down, right? So how can maybe building owners really best install them and keep them from any of these kind of little power outages?
Yeah, set it and forget it, right? Turns out that was
Great dream.
some baloney. But that's why I have a job, so that's good. It's all about expectations, right? And planning, right? So somebody builds the solar, and then it gets handed off to somebody who operates it. That milestone is very important. It's very important once you go from construction to operation, that everything gets handed off in a clean slate. You know exactly what's installed, you flag any sort of issues, etc. So asset owners are starting to realize that investment of, hey, if we invest a little bit more time and money at that milestone and say, and check everything and make sure everything's corrected, and if not, we bring it back to the installer and they remediate it, typically for free. That's a lot cheaper than not doing that, waiting 5 years and realizing, hey, they forgot X, Y, and Z, and now we have issues that are causing reputable damage. It's those types of investments people are realizing that are very important.
Mm-hmm.
And then also just better expectations of budgeting, right? With any technology, when you install it and when things go live, there's a higher incident rate of failure in the beginning, right? You're ironing out the kinks. It's no different with solar. So it's a better expectation of, hey, when it goes live, things will break at a higher incident rate initially and then cool down a little bit over time, and budgeting accordingly.
Yeah, and obviously not every property owner is lucky enough to have someone like Kath, right, who's like an expert on just this. So I'm sure a lot of property people kind of think, it's kind of outside of my purview. Like I'm just gonna hand it off to the installer and they know what they're doing, right? But you're saying you do have to really kind of educate yourself and sit on top of this process when it's coming on.
100%, yeah, and making sure you have somebody from the outside looking in, right? You don't want the installer checking off, signing off.
They'll tell you everything's fine, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course. Have somebody else. It's a little bit more. It's a little more investment, a little bit more time. But wow, I mean, so much pain can be alleviated and it's for everybody's benefit.
Sure.
Yeah,
Well, let's
Franco,
talk-
I just wanted to add one more thing. It's interesting, thinking about what data you need for better energy management. So there was a time in multifamily where, again, we were just concerned about the common areas. Those were our bills, and the residents, would pay their own different utilities bills. And I think there is this growing need to understand demand per unit. And I think Tony was alluding to this. There are jurisdictions where it's really hard to back into that information. But I think on the market, I've seen folks coming up with creative ways to back into it, whether it's different, honestly, like regulatory loopholes, or is it through resident authorization, et cetera. Because ultimately, when we're reporting to investors or different frameworks, whole building consumption is what we are responsible for. And so whether or not we have line of sight, or whether or not we can control sort of resident behavior and consumption, we're still responsible for it. So I think that's getting that granular data is becoming a new focus, getting a better understanding of what the residents are being billed in some way, especially as there are more resident protections around billing. If you are using a third-party provider, whatever it is, there are certain billing allocation methods that are in place. In some areas, there are caps on what residents can charge. And generally, if they notice that their energy bills are going up, for example, if they are upset and don't feel great about it, the owners become responsible for that relationship and reaction. So just wanted to put a fine point on, I think there's a growing, maybe obsession's a strong word, but I think it's an obsession with what's going on in the units, and how we can get better data around that in a way that doesn't invade privacy and that is helpful to the resident experience.
Yeah, great point. Love to talk a little bit about these insights, right? Okay, so let's assume that we're getting all the data that we need. It's all kind of coming in clearly. What can it tell us about the building, and particularly, like, how can it be used to actually drop energy usage, right? We've already talked about, a lot of times these are tenant controlled spaces. Cass, I'll stick with you here to talk about multifamily, and then I want to expand it to some other property types. But like, how do you, okay, we know that this unit is using, way more energy, or this building is using way more energy than the rest of our portfolio. How do you actually go about bringing that energy usage down?
Yeah, I mean, you either have an integration that you've selected that can automatically adjust things for you. That's sort of the technological fix, but ultimately it's up to the teams that are analyzing the information to choose the most financially optimized and least disruptive pathway forward, for the asset. I don't want to oversimplify it, but we can get into the dirt of like how you pick vendors and how you pick solutions. And I think every company goes about that very differently, but ultimately that's what it takes. Assume that you have the best data possible at a certain point after you've done your QA, QCing, scrubbing, et cetera, and then figure out your strategy for integration, tackling it, reducing it over time. I think there are different vendors who have sort of different solutions over time. Tony kind of, again, talked about sort of that automation feature. So if you have something that can kind of detect your thresholds, you set that as a business, maybe it can adjust. I love to use the thermostat example because there are ones that are very smart and that can adjust in certain spaces over time. But again, going back to the residential unit component, unless you are able to get those upgrades in ahead of time and communicate that to the resident as a feature, and maybe some that make clear sort of your, ownership desires around how they operate, maybe that thermostat, leave it alone, don't touch it, let it be set at these different times, which who knows if they're going to adhere to that. I think the in-unit transition is a little more complicated.
Yeah. And obviously there's an opt-in aspect of it, right? Some people are like, super sensitive to anybody messing with, their
Right.
stat or anything in their home. So that makes sense. Tony, let's maybe expand this to talk about some other property types, right? We have, retail and office. They still have mostly tenant controlled spaces, but now you're dealing with maybe corporations that have sustainability mandates, right? They might be a little bit more willing to work with landlords. Likewise, I know a lot of these systems actually do reporting and work with the landlord or with the tenants as well. So, how do you think that maybe the property industry, property owners can kind of use data to bring down the energy usage in places where it's not as easy as, turning off a light when no one's there?
Yeah, sure. So I want to define what the perfect data set is before I answer that question. I think when you look at traditionally like age and condition of existing equipment, right? That everyone's kind of familiar. When you buy a building, you order a PCA and you see age and condition, and that's generally how CapEx is being spent, right? It's end of useful life. This system is 10 years old, useful life is 12, and we're replacing it in 2 years. And then we kind of layer in energy information, right? The perfect information is, at the unit level having utility bills, right? We know exactly how much energy this tenant is using, right? But then we can layer in controls too. We know when the chiller is turning on. We know when the tenant is occupying the space, when they're leaving the space. We also know carbon performance over time, right? Carbon is dynamic, right? So a few months ago, I would say the grid is decarbonizing. I'm not too sure about that anymore, but there is a certain bit of the grid will decarbonize over time, and perhaps it's getting cleaner, so that if your goal is to decarbonize, you need to understand what the carbon performance is going to be of your building if you do nothing. And then I also want to add in the perfect amount of data is also considering resilience into this as well, right? I think when I just have to bring it in because efficiency and resilience sort of go hand in hand, right? When you look at the PCA, it's not just age and condition. Is if you do have an adverse event, right, an acute climate event like a wildfire, or a hurricane, or a flood, how is this building going to fare, right? And we should look at all these items when considering CapEx planning, right? So you take that office building. Right. So we want to look at, hey, when is the chiller end of useful life? I can, at this point in time, decide, do we stay with, let me take a gas boiler, for example, right? Do we go more efficient with gas, or do we fuel switch, right? That's an end of useful life item, right? If we look at the carbon performance of a time and there's a penalty, well, I'm going to incur a penalty. So I might want to advance that capital improvement to fuel switch from gas to electric. But at that very same time, I'm looking at, hey, I'm more prone to flooding, right? The last big hurricane, I had a little bit of water damage. My next one is predicted to be higher. So I might want to relocate my boiler from the ground floor to the first floor to the rooftop. So these are all the various considerations that we have to look at when we're doing CapEx planning. Energy is a focus, but we're looking at traditional due diligence. We're looking at which age and condition, but you also got to factor in resilience too, because at that point in time, that makes all the sense in the world. You hate to do a big old capital improvement project and miss one of the most glaring risks that building owners have, which is some of these climate events that can happen. So again, office and retail, it's looking at all these data points, right? It's what impacts this particular asset the most, and looking at all these various factors and analyzing it, right? I think it's so data tells you everything. My personal concern is there's just too much data, right? CAS, I mean, the amount of subject matters you had to become proficient at in the past 10 years probably tripled.
Right.
And I think that's part of the concern is how do you manage all this information?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot coming in and a lot to consider. I mean, do you think that building owners are maybe getting better at understanding the trade-offs, right? I think the past was much like you said, when it breaks, we'll figure it out, right? Once it breaks, we'll but now I think that we're starting to see, particularly if you have sustainability mandates or you're, buildings in a place where they have to, right? Well, maybe this piece isn't broken, but it's just starting to the efficiency is starting to drop, or we could significantly boost our efficiency by replacing this, even though it isn't necessarily broken. Do you think owners are getting a little bit better about kind of weighing those?
I think if from my perspective, it's institutional capital, right? If you're raising it from pension funds and life insurance companies, there are kind of broader goals. I think those owners are very sophisticated. I think when you're located in a jurisdiction where there's energy efficiency or carbon performance requirements, they have to become sophisticated. I think the rise in property insurance costs and the inability to get property insurance, some instances are making owners more sophisticated. So I think it just kind of varies. There are extrinsic factors that make people more sophisticated, because real estate people are in general smart and they're very bottom line driven. But if there's no reason, incentive, or requirement, it's a little bit of the passive least of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Matt, I want to bring you in here just to hear what you have to say about, kind of using this data to understand how to, lower energy bills. Obviously, you're looking at things from a renewable standpoint, but, I'm sure that a lot of people maybe are pushing back on, do we need that right now? Maybe if we wait a little bit, these, a lot of these incentives might come back. I guess it'll probably be 3 years at this point until we get another administration. But, what is the kind of ways that people, building owners and managers, are able to use data to understand where their, on-site generation is now and maybe where it could be with some investment?
Yeah. Optimization is all about dollars, right? It's for how many kilowatt hours that we can increase out of a system, how many dollars will it cost to do that? And to understand that question, it really all comes down to the why, right? If a system is on-site generation is not meeting the efficiency or output that it's intended to, you have to answer the question why. If a plant is at 50% generation and it's due to either widespread failure of equipment versus soiling versus snow coverage, the cost to increase the performance due to those reasons are vastly different, completely different. Some might not even require you to do anything at all. And so, understanding the payback period for those types of remediation paths are very important, because ultimately it comes down to dollars. And so, to answer the question of why, it goes back to data too, right? Having the right data set and being able to analyze it, look at trends and say, hey, this is why this asset is underperforming, and this is what we're going to do about it. So, we're seeing that, if there can be a clear articulation of a payback period, folks are making that investment in remediation.
How good are some of these models at understanding, like the sun, for example, right? How many cloudy days, how much sun at what exposure you're getting? Are they pretty accurate? Can the property industry kind of rely on those?
Absolutely. Yeah, we actually for very large solar plants, they usually use on-site instruments to measure the irradiance and wind speed and other factors. We actually use satellite irradiance data to analyze our fleets, and we actually find that it's actually more efficient, it's cheaper, you don't have to maintain anything, and it's extremely accurate. And so you're able to see down to kind of the site level what the expected irradiance is for a given project, and that helps you answer why, right? If a site's not generating as much as you anticipated it, but there wasn't much sun that day, that could be why, comparatively to a day where there's a lot of sun. So yeah, those are extremely important signals, and with advancements in recent years, we can actually get them remotely, which is a lot more efficient.
That's cool. Well, let's talk about upgrades, right? I mean, there is this idea of impactfulness, right? There's the cost, the benefit, and then the impactfulness. I think that when you bring that in, you're starting to look at, your sustainability, your greenhouse gases, right? All of those things that maybe aren't just the top and the bottom lines. What are some of the best ways to determine what are the upgrades that are really going to impact the property the most? Cass, we'll start with you on this one again.
Yeah, I think understanding, your overall, I mean, we're in the midst of our strategy right now where we're aiming towards like transition planning. And so as that plan is really put together, what we consider to be impactful will be, what are the costs that are high that we know we can drive down? What is actually going to drive down emissions, et cetera? What's going to translate to the highest valuation if we decide to sell an asset, and ultimately what gets us closer to the returns profile that we've, you know, promised investors. So those are some of the things that we think about. But I think, you know, everything at this point is around, okay, how can we be predictive? So we think being predictive is going to be impactful, whether it's around, you know, energy usage, whether it's around water conservation, you know, that's why sensor technology exists, et cetera. Doing those things helps us prevent what could be catastrophic, whether there's variability in energy consumption with changing pricing, or whether there's a leak that we didn't catch in time and now this is something that, you know, we're going to have to pay for. So I think from a sustainability standpoint, from a utility standpoint, we think of energy, water, waste, emissions, and those are the categories that we need to tackle until they're completely controlled. And, you know, I think in other areas where, you know, it's gray, not everything's black and white, like where we might think, okay, this could be impactful, but we don't understand if it's truly going to deliver during the return period, or maybe we're not sure about the hold of this asset, whatever it might be. We think about scenario analysis and piloting, right? Seeing within a short period of time what is financially optimizing something. And if it's not working, we need to pull it off quickly, again, in any of those categories. So that's the lens that we have in terms of thinking through most impactful upgrades. But again, it's thinking through energy, water, waste, emissions, and then, you know, what ultimately fits with what we can do at the asset. There's a lot to consider from just a community management perspective.
Sure.
So, yeah.
Yeah, we got a question here, and you kind of answered it, but I'll just maybe bring it out because it kind of puts things in a different light. It's like, which ROI models or frameworks have you found the most effective for quantifying the value of, they say AI or IoT, but really any investment, right? Any investment, like, so where does the sustainability aspect fit? Where does the kind of, you know, future proofing fit? Is the model just how much we're going to spend and how much we're going to save, like, or do you kind of bring in all of these other factors as well?
Yeah, I think there's, I mean, we lead with the, you know, quantitative, thinking through, and then you think about the, I don't want to call them normal return periods. I think that has changed a lot, even for like solar modeling, where we thought it could be within 3 or 4 years. There are some scenarios where they might model it a little further out. So, but there's something customary about each type of project. You know, when you do like an LED retrofit, for example, you expect some immediate change in your consumption and cost profile. So I think each one of those categories has their own methodology and expectation. There are others that are a little more qualitative, and that's specifically around climate. So qualitative in the sense that, you know, you have to do some level of a sophisticated assessment. You know that you need to be able to speak to high level quantification of the financial risk as tied to whatever climate risk that you've identified and whether or not it's in orange or red, right? And then you dial that in, for example, in multifamily with your operations team to say, this is how much of the risk we've considered in insurance. This is how much of it we've considered via what we can do operationally, whether it's through early warning, wrapping pipes that we don't want to burst, et cetera. And that gets very granular per asset. So I think it's a mix of both, but I really do think there are some of these projects and categories that have their own expected timeline, even with the shifting market and incentives. And then it's up to your individualized business to determine like what is your appetite for that, right? If a 7-year payback on a solar model doesn't work for you, because by then you expect to sell the asset, then you got to think about something else in your strategy. So.
Yeah, I hear that over and over again, that, you know, some of these upgrades only make sense if you're a long-term hold kind of an owner, right? Because then you're pushing out this modeling way longer, and a lot more things I think make sense. Sure. Tony, I'm interested to hear from you. Obviously, you guys deal with, again, the office, the retail, all of these other asset classes, right? So, you know, what's the kind of the best way, do you think, to model this? Obviously, you guys just present to the information a lot of times, but I'm sure you see the feedback, right, when you're dealing with your clients.
Yeah, obviously, simple payback is very common. Another one that's kind of common too is looking at the energy savings and maintenance savings incurred by certain capital investments, and then capping that savings, right? And then looking at that multiple of that investment. So that's another metric that, a lot of these things can have 2-3 time multiples over what the initial investment is, right? So even people that have short-term holds, right, if they can prove that, hey, you're going to appreciate lower operating costs, lower energy costs, that's a value that you can sell to the buyer. So that's something that we look at quite often. I say again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but again, jurisdictions where there are penalties for carbon performance and energy performance, you got to integrate that. It's not just in your hold period, right? So what you really got to look at is in your disposition. Is the next guy that's buying your building, is that person going to experience a substantial penalty? Because if they are, they're going to negotiate for that. So that's something you need to capital plan for during your hold period, just because that potential buyer is going to know about it. And there's going to be some transparency there, and there's going to be there will be negotiations happening. So it's not just your whole period; it's the next. And then talking a little bit more about resilience and climate hazard. I think that's just a lot of properties. Again, it's the yellow and it's the orange and the red, right? If you have high acute risk, medium acute risk, it pays to look to see if some best practices are there depending on the hazards, right? Cass mentioned, pipe wrapping. That makes all the sense in the world. Freeze detection. Wildfire, just tree landscape management, removing wood chips, right? There's very cost-effective ways to reduce significantly your hazard risks for particular climate hazards. And again, I think what we'll see in the future a little bit is insurance companies are going to ask for more data, right? I think is just if you look at it, like 5 years ago, no one really cared about what all the data around the physical properties are for climate hazards, right? You just got property insurance. You did the address, the size, and the type.
Right.
You got a quote. But today it's become a lot more sophisticated with a lot more folks asking for COPE data, which is construction, occupancy, protection, exposure data to underwrite physical risk insurance, right? And with good data, you will have good rates. And then with improvements, you can further improve your rates or matter of fact, just get coverage in general. So I think that data just becomes it's just things you just got to do to even get insurance from that perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of point to end on, right? Is that we talked for a long time about this kind of green premium, right? If you make a very sustainable building, it should be worth more, right? Your terminal value when you sell the building should go up. I think that we have seen that some places. I don't know if it's 100% shown up everywhere, but I think that what we've already seen is that the other side of that, which is we call like the brown discount, right? Particularly in a place like you're talking about that has fines that are going to start at some point for where you are. I think we're already starting to see those buildings start to sell for less, right? Now as a buyer, you're going to go in, particularly when you use a company like Partner, and they tell you all the things that is wrong with the building. There's going to be a big expense coming in, right? And so you expect at least that much of a haircut off of the price, and I think we're starting to see that a lot more. And hopefully that will push sustainability to this point where now you are getting this kind of green premium. But I know that certainly those fines can add up and can scare buyers off, right? I certainly would think twice about buying a building where I knew, and especially with the changing regulatory environment that we're in right now, right? Fast forward a couple of years and the fines could be a lot worse and things could be worse. So I just want to thank all of you for joining. I want to remind everyone watching that this will be available on demand. If you use the same link to use to log into this, you can watch it later, share it with your friends and family. Also, if any of you would like to be put in contact with any of the panelists here, please send me an email and I can facilitate that. It's franco@propmoto.com, FRANCO@propmoto.com. Cass, Matt, Tony, thanks for the great conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.